The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. It was 9:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the municipal court was operating with its usual methodical efficiency. Judge Michael Harrison, known for his punctuality and no-nonsense approach, adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the day's docket. At 42, he had earned a reputation as one of the city's youngest and most stringent municipal court judges. The courthouse regulars, clerks, attorneys, and bailiffs moved with practiced precision through the morning's cases. Traffic violations, minor disputes, and parking tickets. The mundane machinery of local justice turned steadily. Judge Harrison maintained an expression of studied neutrality, his gavel tapping out the rhythm of justice at precisely the right moments. When the clerk called out case number 47B, Dorothy Mae Williams, few paid attention. It was, after all, just another name in a long list of morning appearances. The shuffle of feet against the worn carpet announced her approach to the podium. And for a moment, the routine nature of the proceedings continued unchanged. Ms. Dorothy Williams stepped forward, her silver hair catching the sunlight. At 73, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to belong to another era. Her blue dress was pressed perfect, despite its age, and her small hat sat at a precise angle. In her weathered hands, she clutched a small envelope and her bus pass, markers of a life lived carefully and within modest means. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying a gentle southern lilt that seemed to soften the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. "I'm here about the parking ticket I received last Thursday." Her hands, marked with the subtle tremors of age, carefully opened the envelope to retrieve the citation. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers. These cases were straightforward. 5 minutes at most, decision rendered, next case called. The efficiency of his courtroom was a point of pride. His eyes scanned the violation. Parking in a restricted zone for 20 minutes, a clear infraction of City Ordinance 23.4. "Ms. Williams," he began, his tone carrying the automatic authority of his position. "The citation indicates you parked in a restricted loading zone for 20 minutes on Thursday, April 15th. Do you contest these facts?" His pen hovered over the form, ready to process another routine case. Ms. Williams adjusted her glasses, the movement deliberate and dignified. "No, Your Honor, I don't contest the time or place." She paused, swallowing slightly. "But if I might explain the circumstances." The morning light had shifted, creating a warm glow around her slight frame. From the gallery, a few regular court watchers leaned forward, perhaps sensing something different in her bearing, something that distinguished her from the usual parade of nervous defendants. The corner of the envelope she held bore careful handwriting, an address written in blue ink, each letter formed with painstaking precision. A small tear in the paper had been carefully mended with clear tape, suggesting it contained something of value. Her Social Security check, perhaps, or carefully saved money for the expected fine. Judge Harrison's finger tapped his desk twice, a habit he'd developed to keep proceedings moving. He'd already begun to write the standard fine amount when Ms. Williams shifted her weight, the floorboard beneath her feet releasing a soft creak that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. For reasons he couldn't quite name, the sound made him pause, his pen hovering above the paper as morning light continued to stream through the tall windows, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air between them. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, breaking the momentary silence. The morning's efficiency had already been compromised by a lengthy divorce dispute, and he was determined to make up for lost time. His calendar showed 14 more cases before lunch, and the afternoon docket was equally full. "Ms. Williams, the ordinance is quite clear regarding loading zones," he stated, his tone carrying the weight of authority earned through years on the bench. "These areas must remain clear for emergency vehicles and authorized deliveries." He reached for his reading glasses, a gesture that usually signaled an imminent judgment. But Ms. Williams took a small step forward, her sensible shoes making no sound on the courtroom floor. "Your Honor, if I may." Her voice carried neither desperation or defiance, just quiet dignity. Mrs. Peterson. She lives in the apartment above mine. She had run out of her heart medication. The pharmacy wouldn't deliver until the next day, and she couldn't walk the 3 blocks herself. The judge's pen tapped against his desk calendar. Standard procedure suggested a quick decision, a fine, and movement to the next case. Yet something in Ms. Williams' calm demeanor made several audience members lean forward in their seats. Even the usually disinterested court reporter found herself watching the elderly woman with unusual attention. "I know the loading zone was meant for deliveries," Ms. Williams continued, her hands folded neatly over her small purse. "But Mrs. Peterson, she's 84 and lives alone. When she called me that morning, her voice was shaking. I couldn't say no." She adjusted her glasses with steady fingers, though her voice held a slight tremor. Sometimes being a good neighbor means making hard choices. Judge Harrison felt a flicker of impatience. He'd heard countless explanations before. Each defendant had a story, a reason, an excuse. The law existed precisely to prevent personal circumstances from overriding public safety needs. His reputation for strict adherence to regulations had earned him respect among his peers. "Ms. Williams," he began, his voice carrying the finality of judgment, $150 fine, due within 30 days. His gavel rose and fell with practiced precision. "Next case." The elderly woman's shoulders dropped slightly, but her expression remained serene. She reached into her purse and withdrew a carefully folded handkerchief, dabbing delicately at the corner of her eye. The motion was so subtle that most observers missed it, but the morning sunlight caught the slight tremor in her hand. As she turned to leave, several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young law clerk at the side of the room frowned slightly, making a note in her pad. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, seemed to watch Ms. Williams with unusual attention as she gathered her belongings. Judge Harrison had already begun reviewing the next case file when he noticed Ms. Williams pause at the courtroom door. She turned slightly, looking back not at him, but at the empty chair where she had stood moments before. Her expression held something indefinable, not anger or resignation, but a kind of gentle remembrance, as if the moment had stirred some distant memory. The sunlight streaming through the high windows had shifted, creating a soft halo around her silver hair. For a brief instant, the harsh fluorescent lights seemed to dim, and the courtroom felt warmer, more intimate. Then she opened the heavy wooden door, and the spell was broken. The mechanical process of justice resumed its steady pace, but something in the air had changed, a subtle shift that even the most seasoned courtroom observers couldn't quite name. The heavy courtroom door had barely begun to close behind Ms. Williams when something extraordinary happened. As she stepped through the doorway, she paused for just a moment, her hand resting lightly on the wooden frame. Then, in a voice so soft it might have been mistaken for a whisper, she spoke words that would shatter Judge Harrison's carefully ordered world. "God bless you, little Michael," she murmured, the words carrying across the quiet courtroom like a gentle breeze from the past. "You always did have your mama's determined spirit." The pen in Judge Harrison's hand froze mid-signature. The familiar rhythm of his courtroom, the shuffle of papers, the whispered conversations, the steady tap of his clerk's keyboard, all faded to silence. That voice, that gentle, warm voice that had once chased away childhood nightmares and soothed scraped knees. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Suddenly, he was no longer 42 years old, sitting high on the bench in his pressed black robes. He was 6 again, sitting at a worn kitchen table while gentle hands helped him with his multiplication tables. He was 8, being comforted after a schoolyard bully had stolen his lunch money. He was 10, proudly showing off his first-place science fair ribbon to the woman who had spent weeks helping him perfect his project. The memories cascaded through his mind like autumn leaves caught in a warm breeze. The smell of fresh-baked cookies on rainy afternoons. The sound of hummed spirituals while she ironed his school clothes. The feel of her warm hand holding his as they walked to the corner store for penny candy after he'd gotten straight A's. Judge Harrison's fingers trembled as he set down his pen. The next case file sat unopened before him, but his eyes remained fixed on the doorway, where Ms. Williams' silhouette still lingered. How had he not recognized her? How had he missed the familiar way she tilted her head when speaking, the distinctive lilt in her voice that had once made even his mother's strictest punishments seem bearable? The courtroom waited in puzzled silence. The clerk cleared her throat softly, preparing to call the next case. But Judge Harrison raised his hand, a gesture so unexpected that even the seasoned bailiff straightened to attention. "Ms. Williams," he called out, his judicial demeanor cracking like thin ice in spring. His voice, usually so controlled and measured, held a note of something his regular courtroom observers had never heard before: vulnerability. She turned slowly, and in that moment, the harsh fluorescent lights seemed to soften. The morning sun streaming through the high windows cast a gentle glow around her, and Judge Harrison saw past the silver hair and lined face to the woman who had once bandaged his cuts, checked his homework, and taught him that true strength lay in kindness. "Miss Dottie?" he asked, the childhood name slipping out before he could stop it. His hand gripped the edge of the bench as the weight of recognition settled over him like a heavy blanket. A smile spread across Ms. Williams' face, warming the room like a sunrise. "I wondered when you'd remember, child," she said softly, her eyes twinkling with the same gentle wisdom that had guided him through countless childhood troubles. "You've grown so tall, but your eyes, they're still the same curious eyes that used to beg for just one more bedtime story." The courtroom fell into an expectant hush as Judge Harrison slowly removed his glasses, placing them carefully on the bench before him. His hands, usually so steady as they handled legal documents, trembled slightly as he studied Ms. Williams' face. Time seemed to peel away like pages from an old calendar, revealing the woman who had shaped his earliest years. "Order in the court," the bailiff announced automatically, though no one had made a sound. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows caught dust motes in the air, creating a dreamlike quality that matched the surreal moment unfolding before them. Judge Harrison's mind raced through a kaleidoscope of memories. There was Miss Dottie, teaching him to tie his shoelaces with infinite patience, using the bunny ears method when the regular way proved too difficult for his small fingers. He remembered her voice singing, "This Little Light of Mine," while she braided her daughter's hair, letting him hold the colorful hair ribbons. The scent of her sweet potato pie, made from her grandmother's recipe, would fill the kitchen every Sunday afternoon. "Your Honor." The clerk's uncertain voice broke through his reverie. "Shall I call the next case?" Judge Harrison stood, an unprecedented action that sent a ripple of whispers through the gallery. His judicial robe suddenly felt heavy on his shoulders, weighted with the realization of how he had treated someone who had shown him nothing but kindness throughout his childhood. "Miss Dottie," he said again, his voice carrying the warmth of remembered affection. "You used to leave notes in my lunchbox, little drawings of smiley faces and stars. Even in second grade, when I said I was too old for them, you just made them smaller so only I would know they were there." Ms. Williams nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You were such a proud little boy," she said softly, "always wanting to stand on your own 2 feet. But everybody needs a little reminder that they're loved, even grown-up judges." The gallery watched in amazement as Judge Harrison stepped down from the bench, his formal demeanor dissolving with each step. He remembered how she had stayed late without pay when his mother's nursing shifts ran long, how she had attended every Little League game, even though her own son had made the competing team, how she had taught him to iron his own shirts, because a man should know how to take care of himself. "You taught me my multiplication tables," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "using M and M's as counters, one for each right answer. And you tried to sneak extras when you thought I wasn't looking." She laughed softly, the sound exactly as he remembered it. "But you learned them, didn't you? Top of your class in math that year." The morning light caught the silver in her hair, and Judge Harrison saw both versions of her at once, the younger woman who had guided his childhood, and the elegant elder who now stood before his court. The weight of his earlier judgment pressed heavily on his conscience. "Miss Dotty," he began, but she shook her head gently. "You've done well for yourself, little Michael," she said, using his childhood name with natural affection. "Your mama would be so proud to see you up there in your judge's robes. Though," she added with a familiar twinkle in her eye, "she might remind you about what we taught you about walking in another person's shoes before making judgments." In the solitude of his chambers, Judge Harrison sat at his mahogany desk, his robes draped over the back of his chair. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the wall of legal texts and certificates that had defined his career. But his eyes were fixed on something else entirely. A small, worn photograph he kept tucked away in his desk drawer for years. The image showed a beaming 10-year-old boy standing beside a chocolate birthday cake, Miss Dotty's arm wrapped proudly around his shoulders. He remembered that day with crystal clarity. She had surprised him by decorating the kitchen with handmade paper streamers, even though she'd worked a double shift the day before. The cake wasn't store-bought like his friends had, but it was made with real cocoa powder she'd saved up to buy, just because she knew chocolate was his favorite. His fingers traced the edge of the photograph, feeling the slight curl of its aged corners. On his desk lay the morning's court documents, including Ms. Williams' parking citation. The contrast between the love shown in the photo and his earlier harsh judgment felt like a physical weight on his chest. "What happened to me?" he whispered to the empty room. When had he started seeing case numbers instead of people? When had efficiency become more important than understanding? He stood and walked to the window, watching people enter and exit the courthouse below. Each person carried their own story, their own reasons for being there. How many times had he dismissed those stories in favor of strict adherence to protocol? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His clerk entered with the afternoon docket, but paused when she saw his expression. "Is everything all right, Your Honor?" she asked, placing the files carefully on his desk. Judge Harrison turned from the window. "Sarah, do you remember your first-grade teacher?" he asked unexpectedly. "Mrs. O'Brien," she answered without hesitation. "She used to bring oranges for kids who didn't have lunch." He nodded, picking up the photograph again. "Miss Dotty was more than just a nanny. She taught me things no law book could ever explain. When the neighbor kids wouldn't play with me because my clothes were secondhand, she told me that character isn't pressed into your clothes, it's pressed into your heart." Walking back to his desk, he noticed a small tin next to his computer, the same kind Miss Dotty used to keep her sewing supplies in. She would sit in their kitchen, mending his school uniforms while helping him practice his vocabulary words. "Add a stitch in time, add a word in mind," she would say, making a game of it. The judge opened his desk drawer and pulled out his daily schedule book. Between the pages lay a faded piece of paper, one of the lunchbox notes she used to write. He'd kept it all these years without really knowing why. The simple message read, "Be somebody's blessing today." His eyes moved to the court calendar on his wall, filled with neatly scheduled 15-minute slots for hearing cases. The system was efficient, yes, but at what cost? Miss Dotty had spent hours teaching him that true wisdom meant taking time to understand people's stories. "Cancel my afternoon appointments," he told his surprised clerk. "And please ask Officer Thompson to locate Ms. Williams before she leaves the building." It's time I started remembering the most important lessons I ever learned, and they weren't in law school. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the chamber windows as Officer Thompson escorted Ms. Williams back to Judge Harrison's office. She had been waiting for her bus when they found her, still holding the envelope containing her fine money. As she entered the chambers, her eyes widened at the sight before her. Judge Harrison had cleared his formal desk, replacing legal briefs with a delicate china teapot and 2 cups he'd hurriedly borrowed from the courthouse cafeteria. Steam rose gently from the pot, carrying the familiar scent of chamomile, the same tea she used to serve him when he was sick in bed with childhood fevers. "You still remember," she said softly, noticing the honey jar beside the cups. She had always added just a touch of honey to his tea, calling it sunshine in a cup to make him smile through his sniffles. "I remember everything, Miss Dottie," he replied, his voice gentle as he pulled out a chair for her. His judicial robe hung forgotten on its stand, and he'd rolled up his shirt sleeves, a gesture that made him look more like the boy she'd known than the judge he'd become. As she settled into the chair, her eyes caught sight of the old photograph on his desk. "Oh my," she breathed, picking it up carefully. "Your 10th birthday. I'd saved for weeks to buy that cocoa powder from the specialty store. You were so proud of helping me stir the batter. You let me lick the spoon," he smiled, pouring the tea with slightly trembling hands, "even though Mama said it would spoil my dinner." "Sometimes a little spoiling is good for the soul," she replied, accepting the cup with a familiar grace. "Like when you had that terrible math test coming up, and I let you stay up an extra hour to practice. Your mama never knew." Judge Harrison sat across from her, not behind his imposing desk, but beside it, like they used to sit at the kitchen table during their after-school talks. "You kept all my report cards," he remembered suddenly, "in that blue folder with the silver stars on it." "I still have them," she said, reaching into her large purse. Along with this, she withdrew a carefully folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a crayon drawing he'd made in 2nd grade, a stick figure in black robes holding what looked like a hammer. "My first drawing of becoming a judge," he whispered, touching the paper gently. "You told me I could be anything I wanted to be. And look at you now," she said proudly, but then her expression softened. "Though I hope you haven't forgotten what else I taught you about judging. To look with my heart as well as my eyes," he finished, the childhood lesson flooding back. "To remember that everyone has a story worth hearing." Miss Dottie reached across the table and straightened his tie, just as she used to do before school pictures. "Your mama worked so hard to give you opportunities," she said softly. "But she gave you something even more precious when she chose me to help raise you. She gave you a chance to see the world through eyes of love." A tear slipped down Judge Harrison's cheek, catching them both by surprise. Miss Dottie pulled out her ever-present handkerchief, the same one she'd used to dry his childhood tears, and passed it to him with a gentle smile. "Still keeping it close," she said, patting his hand. "Some habits never change." The following weeks brought changes to both Judge Harrison's courtroom and his life that no one could have predicted. The parking ticket that had brought Miss Dottie back into his life lay forgotten in a drawer, replaced by something far more valuable, a renewal of connection that touched everyone around them. His first visit to her apartment revealed a modest but immaculate home filled with photographs of children she cared for over the decades. Among them, he spotted several of himself at different ages, sleeping on her lap with a book, proudly holding up a science project, graduating from high school. She had followed his journey from afar, collecting newspaper clippings of his achievements and saying a prayer for him each night. "This is Tommy," she said, pointing to a recent photo of a young boy surrounded by textbooks. "His mama works 2 jobs, just like yours did. He comes here after school for help with his reading." Judge Harrison watched as she showed him the calendar on her wall, filled with carefully noted tutoring sessions and doctor's appointments, not for herself, but for elderly neighbors she helped. The judge found himself spending his lunch breaks at her apartment, bringing sandwiches and listening to her stories. Sometimes they sat on her small balcony, where she tended a garden of herbs just like the one she'd kept at his childhood home. "Mint for tea," she explained, pinching a leaf between her fingers, "and basil for remembering summertime." One afternoon, he brought his own children to meet her. His 7-year-old daughter, Emma, was instantly drawn to the gentle way Miss Dottie showed her how to make paper dolls, just as she had once taught him. His 10-year-old son, Michael Jr., sat fascinated as she helped him with his multiplication tables, using the same M&M method that had worked so well decades ago. "Your daddy used to sneak the candies too," she whispered to Michael Jr., making the boy giggle and his father blush. The afternoon light filled her small living room, with warmth as 3 generations shared stories and laughter. But perhaps the most significant change was in Judge Harrison's courtroom. He began taking more time with each case, looking past the paperwork to see the people. When an elderly man appeared for a minor offense, the judge noticed his worn shoes and quiet dignity, reminding him of how Miss Dottie had always carried herself. "Tell me your story," became his new approach, words that would have seemed inefficient just weeks ago, but now felt essential. His clerk noticed that he started keeping a small tin of hard candies in his desk, the same kind Miss Dottie used to give him for courage before school presentations. One morning, he surprised everyone by setting up a small table in the courthouse lobby with coffee and cookies. "Some people come here scared or alone," he explained to his puzzled staff. "Miss Dottie taught me that a little kindness can help someone find their voice." The transformation wasn't just in his professional life. He began volunteering at the community center where Miss Dottie helped with after-school programs. The sight of a judge in reading glasses, sitting patiently with struggling students, became a regular occurrence. "Everyone deserves someone who believes in them," he'd say, echoing words she had once spoken to him. 6 months after that fateful morning in Courtroom 7B, the municipal courthouse had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. The changes weren't visible in the building's architecture or formal procedures, but in the way people carried themselves through its halls, in the small acts of kindness that had become everyday occurrences. Judge Harrison stood before his mirror one morning, adjusting his robes as Miss Dottie had taught him years ago. "Straight lines on the outside," she used to say, "show a straight heart on the inside." As if summoned by the memory, she appeared in his chamber doorway, carrying her signature tin of freshly baked cookies for the courthouse staff. "Still can't get your tie quite right," she smiled, stepping forward to straighten it with familiar hands. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment, he saw both versions of her, the younger woman who had shaped his childhood, and the wise elder who had helped him rediscover his heart. The local newspaper had run a story about their reunion, capturing a photo of Miss Dottie sitting in the judge's chair while he stood beside her, both laughing at the role reversal. The article had sparked something unexpected in the community. Other judges began sharing stories of the people who had shaped their lives: teachers, neighbors, family friends who had shown them kindness when they needed it most. Judge Harrison's courtroom now featured a small sign behind his bench, visible only to him: "Listen with your heart first." The 15-minute hearing slots had been extended to 30 minutes. "Justice needs time to breathe," he'd explained to the administrative board, thinking of how Miss Dottie had always taken time to hear his whole story before helping him solve any childhood crisis. On this particular morning, his first case involved a young mother struggling with parking tickets accumulated while taking her child to medical appointments. Instead of immediately citing regulations, he remembered Miss Dottie's wisdom about walking in others' shoes. The solution they reached involved connecting the woman with a community support program Miss Dottie had helped establish. "Your Honor," his clerk called softly after the case, "the elementary school students are here for their courthouse tour." He smiled, knowing what came next. Every month now, Miss Dottie joined him in welcoming local school children, sharing stories about the importance of understanding and forgiveness. The kids were always fascinated by how she could make even the imposing judge smile like a little boy. "Law books teach us rules," he would tell them, "but people like Miss Dottie teach us wisdom." The children would gather around her as she handed out her homemade cookies, each one coming with a story about kindness and understanding. Later that afternoon, Judge Harrison watched from his window as Miss Dottie waited at the bus stop, surrounded by courthouse staff who now insisted on keeping her company. She had become the heart of their legal community, her presence a reminder that true justice required both knowledge of law and understanding of human nature. Sometimes, she had told him recently, the biggest changes come from the smallest moments of recognition. She had been right, as she so often was. That morning in court had changed not just 2 lives, but an entire system's approach to justice. As the sun set over the courthouse, casting long shadows across its steps, Judge Harrison smiled at the framed photo, now hanging prominently in his chambers, not his law degree or judicial appointment, but that old birthday picture with Miss Dottie. Below it, written in her flowing handwriting, was the message that had started his transformation. Remember, little Michael, every person who stands before you is somebody's child, and every judgment you make is a chance to show grace.